This is a Christian nation.
No, I don't think so.
We were founded on Judeo-Christian principles. Our values and the Constitution are based on the Bible. Take a dollar bill out of your pocket right now and have a look. What does it say on the top, right below the United States of America, on the back? So there's the proof.
I can get rid of that.
Even the Pledge of Allegiance includes the phrase "under God." Modern nationalist mythology and other ridiculous religious arguments like these actually work at convincing some people that secularism is of the devil, the United States' existence is the fulfillment of God's plan. And I'll bet you this 1935 $1 silver certificate that does not read "In God We Trust" on the back won't convince them otherwise. But I bet you as well that every one of those statements that I said just now were uttered this morning in dozens of cathedrals, megachurches, strip mall churches, and rented public elementary school cafetoriums this very morning. Probably more than 100 in the 5 counties we support based on our recent research. Are you tired of hearing that? Yes. Do you have a go-to response when you do? There was a lot less of you that said you have a response than you're tired. So we're going to flip that today. Are you able to respond in any way when you hear these types of arguments? After today, you will be. You'll be armed and ready to fight against the lies and the deceit that have seen their day come and go. Can I get a Darwin? Thank God for the internet, right? Andrew Seidel is an impassioned constitutional attorney with the Freedom from Religion Foundation, our parent organization, as Jocelyn said. He's had a recent promotion. Apparently he was tired of getting so many emails from me that he moved on to become the organization's Director of Strategic Response. But he didn't have the strategy to change his email address, so I still email him. I was doing the math on this the other day, and for the sake of transparency, for the 7 years that I've had his email address, and he hasn't changed it, I've emailed him once a day on average, including weekends. But that wasn't just every email to him asking him, what I could do to help, how I could get a job at the Freedom from Religion Foundation. A lot of it was carbon copied emails on the 2 lawsuits that we've worked on with Andrew and his team and others as well. Andrew has a passion for this topic in particular. He's been writing what has taken a form of a book in most recent years since well before I met him. He has a passion for research. He's an attorney, so he pretty much doesn't have any choice in that passion. He's got a passion for accuracy. There was a small team of attorneys that were tasked on a commission to find errors in his writing. So he was still able to come to Florida on his own dime, I think, so he must not have spent too much money on that. I'm sure he had a good work product to start with. He also has a passion for precision in words. You'll find today, as I did long ago, that if he only had an English accent, a cigarette, and a Scotch whiskey in hand, you'd mistake him for Christopher Hitchens more than occasionally. He also has a passion for Scotch, but I've not seen him with a cigarette in his hand. He has a passion for communication. This can be seen in the letters and articles that he writes for FFRF and the FFRF blog, Freethought Now. He has a passion for being out and proud. His first ever TV interview was on the disgraced Fox News Channel host Bill O'Reilly's O'Reilly Factor, where he disgraced Bill O'Reilly long before he could disgrace himself. He's been writing this book that he's going to talk about today since before I met him, and he sent a copy in 2012 where he was still trying to figure out whether it was going to be a couple of articles or a book or a couple of books, and I was honored to have that opportunity. But this was far longer past in time than he met better writers than me that were able to provide the kind of feedback that he really needed and the advice that he got. If you've seen the jacket of the book, you'll see the kind of support he's got lately. So he's come a long way since asking local organizational leaders to help him with his writing. I could spend a lot longer flattering Andrew, but you didn't come here to hear one another comment, and you didn't come here to hear me talk, so I'm going to introduce my good friend, Andrew Seidel. That was an incredibly kind introduction, being compared to Hitch's. Okay. Christian nationalism is the biggest threat facing America today. That is why I wrote this book, The Founding Myth. Christian nationalism, for those of you who don't know, is the idea that we are founded as a Christian nation, that we are based on Judeo-Christian principles. But it's also the idea that we've strayed from that foundation and that we need to return to those godly roots. And that language of return and the idea that we've strayed is used to justify all manner of Christian nationalist public policy right now, right? Because we have to get back to where we came from. We have to get back to God. The goal here is to redefine America according to the Christian identity. So that to be an American is to be a Christian, and to be a Christian is to be an American. And once that's done, to redefine American law and reshape the law according to that. Now, before Donald Trump, before the 2016 election, Christian nationalism was an impotent sideshow. It was on the fringes of conservative politics. You would hear a lot about it during the Republican primary, but usually not much beyond that, except on the fringes. And it was on the fringes of conservative religion. There were a few court cases where the Supreme Court even looked at some Christian nationalist talking points and kind of incorporated them into law. But for the most part, it was just out there on the fringes. But Donald Trump tapped into something that we had not seen before. He was elected president by the Electoral College, not the majority of the countries, because of Christian nationalism. Not in spite of it, but because of it. The number one factor indicating a Trump voter in the 2016 election was not religion, despite how much you hear about evangelicals supporting Trump. 81% supported him. It was not religion. It was not political party, despite the massive support he had among Republicans. It was not race or racism even. The number one indicator of a Trump voter in 2016 was believing that the United States was founded as a Christian nation. If you were a Christian nationalist, that was the best indicator that you were going to vote for Trump. Now, before 2016, it didn't have power. But now it's got the highest office in the land. And Christian nationalism it is infecting our public policy. You have seen it many times. The Muslim ban. Anybody remember this? It's been a while. That is Christian nationalism. And it actually seeks to protect Christians in a very specific way. Everything that is happening at the Department of Education, which most people don't hear about now because there's so much going on in the news, is Christian nationalism. The goal right there by Betsy DeVos is to dismantle the public school system because it's secular and takes kids away from Jesus. She's been pretty good. School choice, for the most part, is about that. The child separation policy at the border. The justification for that, anybody remember where it came from? The Bible. Romans 13. Jeff Sessions said so, and actually the White House Bible study was where he got that information. I wrote an article for ThinkProgress on this if you want to read more about that. So Christian nationalism has power in a way that we have not seen before. And it's not just these big things too, but even the move of our embassy to Jerusalem, which was a 2-minute story in this current news cycle. That was done for Christian nationalist reasons. Now, the political theology of Christian nationalism, the very identity of the Christian nationalist depends on the myths and the lies that are exposed in this book. David mentioned a few of them already. In God we trust, and one nation under God on our money and in the pledge. The references to God in the Declaration of Independence, it references our Creator 4 times, Donald Trump is fond of saying. That the Founding Fathers prayed at the Constitutional Convention. Neither of those happened. That George Washington knelt in prayer in the snow at Valley Forge.
All of these are central to the Christian nationalist identity. And the idea that America was founded as a Christian nation is central to its hold on political power in the United States right now. Without that historical support, their identity will wither and fade. Their policy justifications begin to crumble. So, to me, the most amazing thing about Christian nationalism is because it's based on these lies and myths, it is incredibly vulnerable and weak. And we have a real opportunity here, because it's based on these historical distortions and lies, to actually destroy it. And that is the purpose of the founding myth. It's a simple, if lofty, goal. I want to utterly destroy the identity of Christian nationalism. Everything that underlies their myths. That's the goal. So the book is not simply a refutation of the idea that we are a Christian nation. That is incredibly important, but that is not enough, because otherwise we wouldn't have a President Trump. So instead I went deeper, because after you hear the Christian nation claim, well, let's do this. How many of you have been in a debate about whether we're founded as a Christian nation? Yeah, most people in the room, it looks like. The fallback position, after you quote the Treaty of Tripoli, maybe, or mention that our Constitution is a godless document, is, well, I didn't mean that we're founded as a Christian nation. I meant that we're based on Judeo-Christian principles. How many people have heard that claim? Yeah. So that is what I actually wanted to do in this book. I examined that second claim. And in doing that, I actually undermined the Christian nation myth as well. So the central question that I ask in the book is, did Judeo-Christian principles positively influence the founding of the United States of America? And the answer to that is no, they did not. Not only did they not influence the founding, it's a good thing they didn't. Because Judeo-Christian principles are fundamentally opposed to the principles on which this nation was built. There is so much disagreement and conflict between the two systems that it is fair to say that Christianity is un-American. So that is the argument that I make in the founding myth. That is the book. It also happens to be the truth. I make the argument in 4 parts, and there are going to be readings today. So I apologize to anybody who's still feeling feelings from church. The book's broken into 4 parts, and the first part is all about the founders and the Declaration of Independence and the colonies. One of the things that I'm trying to do here, well, there's 2 things I'm trying to do for you. It's, as David said, to arm you, to give you better arguments, because facts are not enough anymore. You have to have better arguments. So I'm trying to give you better arguments for when you go out into the world and have to fight these fights. So number 1 is better arguments. I'll leave number 2 for later, actually. So I want to talk about the founders, because I love the founding of this country. To me, it's just one of the most fascinating periods in history. And when you get into the religion of the founding fathers, it's even more exciting. And it's a debate that is really fun to have, and it's completely unfruitful. Okay? We get sucked into it, I think, because it's fun and it's really interesting, but it's not a debate that we should be having, because it doesn't matter. Okay? And so this is the point that I'm trying to make in this reading. Though interesting, the battle over what the founders personally believed is irrelevant to the claim that our nation was founded on Judeo-Christian principles. That the founders had personal beliefs about religion and God does not prove that they used those principles to found a nation. Nor should we make the mistake of assuming that their religious beliefs were static throughout their lives. People's beliefs changed. 2 of my good friends, authors Dan Barker and Jerry DeWitt, were once preachers and are now atheists. It is unlikely that at age 58, Washington held the same beliefs he had at 18. And even were we to concede, for the sake of argument, that the founders were all Christian, the logic required to prove the Christian nationalist argument is flawed, because one's personal theistic beliefs do not own the other ideas generated by one's mind. Now, we would have to go on and examine those beliefs and compare them against the founding principles that actually informed the design of our country, right? So the point I'm trying to make there is that it doesn't matter what the founders believed, because even if they were Christian, you would still have to show that they used Christian principles to build the country. And you can't do that. It simply can't be done. And that's part 2 of the book. Because I'm a lawyer and I thought I was being a little bit clever. Looking back, it's not so clever. Part 2 is titled The U.S. v. the Bible, like a court case. And what I do in part 2 is I actually make that comparison. So I looked through the principles that are fundamental to Christianity and compared them to the principles that are fundamental to the founding of the United States of America. And again, what I found researching and writing this is that the two systems conflict and differ to just a fundamental degree. It's not possible to say that Christianity influenced the founding of the United States of America because there is so much contradiction and conflict between the two systems. So this is from chapter 10, which I titled Redemption and Original Sin, or Personal Responsibility and the Presumption of Innocence. And again, what I'm trying to show is that conflict and that contradiction, and that it is impossible to reconcile these two. The entire Christian religion is based on a singular claim that violates the principle of personal responsibility so critical to our systems of law and government, that Jesus died for your sins. Christianity's rejection of personal responsibility is actually twofold. First, a person is guilty of original sin simply because they were born. To believe this, you must accept not only that all humans descended from the two originals that God created for his garden, but also that all human beings are culpable for the actions of those two forebears, whose disobedience was prompted by a talking snake and was committed millennia ago. Guilt without action is rare under our system of law, but it is the law for much of Christianity. Second, the sacrifice of Jesus means that one's sins are forgiven. This is vicarious redemption through human sacrifice. Jesus as the sacrificial scapegoat. Each idea is repugnant to the American principles in its own way. Original sin confers guilt without regard for personal action, while vicarious redemption absolves that guilt through the torture and murder of another human being. So, that's just one example of the fundamental conflict. Another, probably the most popular claim that you'll hear, and in fact, it was made by Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito last Thursday when he decided the Bladensburg cross case, the 40-foot tall cross sitting on the traffic circle in Maryland, that the court held was, yeah, it's religious, but it's also a secular symbol, so it can stay up, basically. And it's been there for a really long time, so we're going to fix it. Constitution, yeah. The Ten Commandments. That the Ten Commandments influenced or form the basis of United States law. I'm kind of bitter that I actually had to write this one, but this is where the book started. When David mentioned that I was not sure where I was going to go with this, the book started out as a law review article that just got really out of hand. I wanted to write specifically about this claim because it's not the first time the Supreme Court has said something like that. And I was shocked when I was in law school and I read that. And I said, that can't be right. I can't believe the highest justices in the land would think that. I have a very different view of Supreme Court justices now, having practiced the law for almost 10 years. Oh, it is 10 years now. Okay. So I took the time in part 3 to go over all of the Ten Commandments and compare them to America's founding principles. And what I found, again, and I didn't expect to find this going in, was that all of the Ten Commandments are fundamentally opposed to the principles on which this nation was founded. Yes, even the ones that you're thinking, what about that one right there? Yeah, yes, even those. But you have to buy the book. I'm not going to read that part. The part I'm going to read is from the first chapter of part 3. It's called Which 10? This is chapter 13. The Ten Commandments, also known as the Decalogue, supposedly the most moral law known to humanity, and supposedly authored by the biblical God himself, are not easy to find in your Bible. They're not at the beginning of the Bible. God didn't give the rules to Eve and Adam even after their fall. Nor did he give them to Noah after exterminating all human and animal life save Noah's crew. And Noah needed a bit of moral guidance. Noah's son, Ham, accidentally walks in on Noah drunk, naked, and passed out. Refusing to take responsibility for his frat boy behavior, Noah curses an innocent child, Canaan, Ham's son and Noah's own grandson, to a life of slavery. Or Ham's crime of seeing Noah naked crime. Scare quote. This was the only man the Jewish God thought moral enough to save from a worldwide flood. Yahweh did not see fit to give out the laws, his most moral laws, if Christian nationalists are to be believed, until much further along in the biblical storyline. The first set, there are 4, doesn't appear until halfway through the second book of the Bible, Exodus. H.L. Mencken reportedly once quipped, "Say what you will about the 10 Commandments, you must always come back to the pleasant fact that there are only 10 of them." If this wit does indeed belong to Mencken, then so does the error, because there are not 10 commandments, but 4 different sets of 10 commandments. And that's just in any given Bible. And then you can get into the different translations and how the different religions number them and interpret them differently. And they seem like small differences at first. I mean, what's the difference between committing murder and killing? It's a pretty big difference, actually. The law says you can't kill somebody and somebody breaks into your house in the middle of the night, you can't defend yourself. The law says you can't murder somebody, you're allowed to kill them because murder is excusable killing. Right? So it makes a difference how the law is interpreted. Icons or graven images. Which, does the commandment prohibit icons or graven images? Small difference, except that it split Christendom in the 8th and 9th centuries. They had a civil war over that. So, 10 Commandments fundamentally opposed to the founding of the United States as well. And this last part, part 4, is the one that I'm really upset that I had to write, because the arguments are so bad. This is American verbiage. That's what I call part 4. It's all the stuff that you hear probably the most. That we are one nation under God. In God we trust. God bless America. All this just nonsense that's thrown at you. These phrases, lip service. And so that's what part 4 deals with. And I'm just going to read the conclusion of the intro, and then I'll wrap up and take questions. In God we trust, one nation under God, God bless America. These tidbits are not historical so much as they are rhetorical. Their tardiness precludes arguments that they somehow prove the founding ideology. But it's worth analyzing how the verbiage entered the American vernacular, because doing so reveals something interesting about Christian nationalism. Christian nationalists take advantage of times of fear and use them to impose their God on everyone else. When doing so, they often destroy earlier unifying messages with their new divisive message. Since the first years of our founding, citizens' rights have been jeopardized and curtailed by war. Or rather, our rights have been perhaps willingly given up because of the fear of war. But Christian nationalists ignore this, and they recite these religious idioms, each more delinquent relative to the founding than the next, to bolster their arguments. But in each instance, the truant language entered the American vernacular during times of fear and national crisis. During a war in one case, and in another case at a time when witch hunters were looking for nonconformists and non-Christians, while big business was peddling religion to repeal regulations. In the final instance, the intent was to cover the most notorious presidential crimes ever committed. I wrote that before the Mueller report came out, so. But this is really what makes the founding myth different. Right? Previous books have offered a gentle correction to the Christian nationalist. This is what the facts say. This is what history says. This is what the founders really meant when they wrote those words. And they've kind of left it at that. But correction is not enough. Again, otherwise we would not have President Donald Trump. Pointing out errors is insufficient. So this book does that, but then it takes the next step. It goes on the offensive. This book is an assault on the Christian nationalist identity. Not only are Christian nationalists wrong, Their beliefs and their identity run counter to the values of America. They are un-American. So I'm going to leave it at that, and I'm going to take questions. I don't know, David, do you have a thing you want to do for questions? Okay.
Unfortunately, we only have about 3 or 4 minutes for questions. But the good news is that's just the questions part. The answers part, we've got 30, 40 minutes, so we'll be watching the clock. We do want you to line up, though, because it's a hell of a large room today. So if you don't mind lining up, please do that. If you would rather not line up, please do it anyway. If you can't line up, then let me know and I will bring you a microphone. Okay, so if you can't line up, raise your hand and I will be glad to bring you a microphone in turn. Okay?
And I will say, feel free to ask whatever you want. You know, I'd love to talk about the Freedom from Religion Foundation, what you can do as local activists too. You don't have to limit it to the book, but do please limit it to questions, as David said.
Hi, thanks for being here. As a fellow lawyer, I appreciate your points that you raised very cogently. Notwithstanding the insidious creep that you speak of with the Christian nationalism, do we have any room, is there any room for hope and optimism given that we've seen the hypocrisy of this movement laid bare, particularly under Trump? Can you speak to that point? And
yes,
thank you.
Absolutely. I think there's lots of room for hope right now. I know, especially the last 2 weeks, it may not seem like that. But first, in April, Morning Consult, which is a polling group, did a study which said that 48% of the country now views Christian nationalism as a threat or a very serious threat to America. That number is up from we don't know what. Okay, I wrote to the authors of those studies and said, you know, do you have any data from before the election? And they said, no, we have no idea. Nobody knew it was going to be a thing. So I think that's a really good sign that people are starting to wake up. I was shocked when I read that. I would have expected maybe I would have been happy with a quarter of the country seeing Christian nationalism as a threat. So I think that's a very good sign, and I think the more we can talk about Christian nationalism as what we are fighting, and less about theocrats or dominionism or getting this all, we are fighting Christian nationalism, the better off we're going to be. And the other thing, the second reason to be hopeful is what you are seeing right now. I will admit it's terrible, and the last couple weeks in particular have been rough. But this is the religious right, the Christian nationalists raging against the dying of their privilege. That is what is happening right now. They are getting up on Sunday mornings, going to churches, and instead of seeing young faces smiling back at them, they're seeing empty pews. They can read the demographic studies as well as we can. They know where this is going. They know they are losing their power. They are doing everything they can to codify their privilege into law in the meantime. And they're doing massive damage right now. Doing massive damage, and it's going to take a long time for us to undo it. And we're not going to be able to rely on the federal judiciary to undo a lot of it. The good news is we've never been able to rely on the federal judiciary, except for about the 15 years of the war in court for the most part. So I think there is a lot of reason to be optimistic and to be hopeful. And at the end of the day, we are going to win this fight with demographics, however else this goes. So yes, so do not give up hope, please.
Do you know if there are any examples of U.S. presidents during the swearing-in ceremony not saying, "So help me God"?
Yes, there's a whole chapter on that in the book. So Washington did not say that. John Adams did not say that. Thomas Jefferson did not say that. James Madison, James Monroe, John Quincy Adams, on and on. The first president to do that was Chester A. Arthur in 1881. He had already been sworn into office because if you remember his predecessor died. And so he was already president, and this was more of a ceremonial, public ceremony rather than an actual legal effect. So I have a whole chapter in this, and it actually did involve a lot of original research, so if you're curious, that is one little area where the footnotes are a little more substantial, that I had to run down some of this than just citing to other authors and things like that, so feel free to take a peek at those.
So is there some cause and effect mixing going on in this whole argument where because they now have they're redefining Christianity or even Christian myths because they have one fewer?
So I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure how much. I think the more redefining of Christianity that you're seeing right now is what Pete Buttigieg is trying to do, actually. I mean, how many people saw his answer in the debate?
Yeah.
It was a phenomenal answer. I loved it. And the argument that he's trying to make that we should point out that religious hypocrisy, I 100% agree on. It's actually like slightly wrong. Because in the Bible, Jesus, he said, the fact that we're separating families is unchristian and it's hypocritical. Jesus says in the Bible, don't think that I came to bring peace on earth, I came to bring a sword. And he goes on to say, I came to turn mother against daughter, father against, it's pretty clear, like he's trying to say, he's arguing for family separation in a way. The better side of the religious argument is almost always going to be on the regressive side of public policy. And we have seen this time and again throughout history. Slavery. The better side of the theological argument for slavery is undoubtedly with the slave states in the lead up to the Civil War. It says in the Ten Commandments twice it recognizes slavery. It's not prohibited anywhere in the Bible. Jesus talks about how hard you should beat your slaves. Right? So there are tons of, in the lead up to the Civil War, tons of Southern preachers arguing that it is God's will that the South has slavery. And the North cannot beat them in that theological debate. The same thing with segregation, actually. Martin Luther King, we look to him and he did phenomenal work, but he often criticized religion. He said that the church was a tail light, not a headlight. His letter to the Birmingham jail, which I read every MLK Day, he wrote that to white preachers standing on the sidelines, mouthing pious irrelevancies and sanctimonious trivialities. Right? So he was as critical of religion during his time. So I think we have to remember that religion to me is, and I think it's backed up, and there's actually some good research in the book too by Professor Mark Smith, who says that really the driving force in a lot of these liberalizing movements is secularism. And he likens it to the tail wagging the dog. So secularism drives the push towards liberalizing and towards civil rights. And then liberal religion runs to keep up, and then eventually dragging conservative religion along with it. So I think the redefinition that we're seeing is attempting to redefine religion as this bastion of civil rights when it's not. And I'd be willing to bet that in 40 years we'll hear so much about how Christianity supported LGBTQ movement. Seriously.
Hi, thanks for coming.
My pleasure.
You just brought up the cross story recently that we lost in the Supreme Court, and now that we have Judge Canterbury on the Supreme Court, I'm wondering if they're going to go after the lemon test soon. Is there any cases coming up soon that you're worried about?
In reality, the lemon test, it's going to be very hard to argue the lemon test right now. So for those of you who don't know, the typical inquiry that a court would do to determine whether or not the First Amendment was violated. So for instance, when FFRF, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, when we get a complaint, we get between 4,000 and 5,000 state church complaints every single year. And when we get a complaint, we examine it and look, does this violate the law? Is what's happening a violation of the First Amendment? Most of the time it is. There's a lot going on. But to argue that to a court, you have to argue under some sort of legal principle. That's the First Amendment. And then the court interprets it in different ways and they apply different tests. The lemon test has been a big one over the years. And essentially the court asks, does the government action have a religious purpose or a secular purpose? Does it have the effect of inhibiting or advancing religion? And does it entangle the government unnecessarily with religion? That's what they've been asking for since 1973, I think, is when Lemon versus Kirkland came out. The courts have been avoiding that test for a long time, actually, since 1983 in Marsh versus Chambers, a decade later, they applied this historical analysis, which is what the court used to uphold the Bladensburg Cross, which, and I'm going to bring that in and just answer that question because it's going to be coming. There's a 40-foot tall cross, Christian cross, Latin cross in Bladensburg, Maryland, on a traffic circle. The Supreme Court just decided that it could stay against a challenge. They decided it could stay for a couple of reasons. One, they said that it has all this secular meaning because it's a monument to those who died in World War I and other wars. And it's really old. I'm not kidding. And the court pushed aside the Lemon test, and they said, look, it's really old. At some point, it becomes a secular monument, so it can go ahead and stay. They talked a lot about community standards in the decision, which is really alarming, because the entire purpose of the Bill of Rights, including the First Amendment, is to protect the minority from the tyranny of the majority. Community standards does the exact opposite of that. So they also had a lot of mean words for the Lemon test in that decision. I think it's going to be very hard for lawyers who do this kind of work to go into a court now and argue the Lemon test, argue that it's applicable, even though it was not expressly overturned and undercut. One of the justices, it might have been Justice Canterbury, who said that Lemon has been shelved. Now, it doesn't mean that what we do is impossible, but I am working on a law review article that if you follow me on social media, you'll see it when it gets published, about a new test that the court ought to adopt, and why this historical approach that they use, that Justice Alito used to uphold that 40-foot cross, is so very, very wrong. He used a lot of history, and a lot of the arguments that he used to talk about our founding history are actually debunked in this book. So if anyone wants to buy him a copy and send it to him, or a few, so he can read, wouldn't be the worst.
You had mentioned how many of the current public policy decisions are sort of based on the Christian nationalism agenda. What are your thoughts on the ban against transgender individuals in the military? Trump's alleged reason for that was the extraordinary cost of caring for these individuals during their transition in the military, but what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't think anybody believes that. I think it's motivated by hate, and I think a lot of that hate comes out of the Christian nationalist movement. I think that's absolutely true. I do have a couple sections in the book where I talk about LGBTQ rights. And there are a few areas where I've had to concede. If you notice, the question that the way I framed the question in the beginning was, did Judeo-Christian principles positively influence the founding of the United States of America? If I asked it without that positively, it would be a little bit of a different answer, because Judeo-Christian principles have influenced a few areas of our public policy over the decades. And the obsession with regulating sex and all things associated with sex and gender is absolutely one of them. Another area is race relations and slavery. And so I had to concede some influence in a few spots of this book, but none that are positive. Yeah, I think it's just motivated by hate, and that's rooted in Christian nationalism.
I'm going to ask you to play, devil's advocate for just a second.
Happy to do it.
What mystifies me is how people who, in every other area, when I speak with them, seem to be sane. Some of them many quite successful in life. So say I was to put to one of them the following question. Can you name a single theocracy ever that has not turned their country's government into a thugocracy, ever, anywhere? And I'm wondering if they could, and by the way, I would stress the Christian theocracies that ran all of Europe before the founding of this country.
And also began this country, right? I mean, you often hear that the people fleeing Europe came here for religious freedom. I mean, you probably said that, I've said it. It's not true. It's certainly not true when we're talking about the Puritans and the Pilgrims up in Massachusetts. They were fleeing religious persecution, yes. But that's not the same thing as coming for religious freedom. Right? They actually fled to Leiden in the Netherlands, where they had more religious liberty than anywhere else on the planet. Not what we would consider true liberty today, but certainly the most tolerant country on the face of the earth at that time. So tolerant, so much freedom, that their followers were leaving the faith. And the guys were like, look, we got to get out of here. We're losing everybody. So they load them all up on the boats and they take them to the New World where they can actually establish theocracies. and they can enforce the will of their God, right? It wasn't about religious freedom. It was about a theocracy. It was just the right kind of theocracy.
Why don't these theocracies, though, ever, even one, turn out to be a benefit to the average person, increase his freedoms, the quality of his life?
I mean, that's
Has
never,
there ever been one?
and never been and never will be, and it's because of the structure of them.
How can these people who support the movement you're criticizing?
Well, hopefully they'll read the book. And, or get it in the library. I'm happy with that. Go ahead.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm 10 years old, and my question is, I call myself a young politician.
All right.
My question is, how can young people like me make a difference in this?
Oh, that's a great question. I would love to see more young people coming out to these and caring about the issues the way you apparently do. But I think that's the number one thing. And honestly, you guys are going to be dealing with a lot of the fallout from this, from climate change too. And to be honest, there is, sidebar on that, there's a big tie-in with Christian nationalism and climate change. Climate change is absolutely a state church issue. If you don't understand why, I've written a couple things for FFRF about why that is the case. You should check them out. I think the number one thing you can do is start getting involved right now. I mean, I would love to see, and I've said this to everybody at every talk I've given, I would love to see local secular groups in communities like this. And I'm blown away by how much Central Florida Freethought community is doing. The introduction that Jocelyn gave, I'm just astounded by how much. I travel around the country talking to groups like this. Hands down the most active group. And I spoke at Free Flow last time. Do put on the best conference for, I'm sure it's not really even a regional. It's amazing. So you should all go to that. I would love to see also getting organized and running people for office. And we can only do so much on that front as a 501c3. But when the religious right wanted to start building Christian nationalism up and really start fighting back, they encouraged all their churches and their local groups to start running people for school boards and local offices. And by the time the 80s, 90s, and aughts rolled around, they had this massive crop of politicians who have been working their way up. And we're seeing the fruits of that right now. I mean, this was kind of an organized campaign on their part. And we don't have anything equivalent to that right now. And as I've been going around the country talking about the book, I've been encouraging people to go out there and do that. And I think the number one thing that is going through your mind right now is, I could never run for office. What do I know? People want this. I guarantee you are as equipped to run that office as any of them are. So please consider it. I know one young lady who heard my talk, she's older than me, but not much older than me. You can wait a couple of years, but you can start building it up. Is running for school board now as a result. And I would love to hear stories like that from every place that I go and give talks to. It really is critical. Being an out non-believer is, I think, one of the best things that you can do fight against this, and then also learning how to argue against Christian nationalism better. Again, the facts are not enough. The reason that I subtitled the book Why Christian Nationalism is Un-American is because that is our best argument. Right? We need to reclaim patriotism and reclaim what it is to be an American from the Christian nationalists.
I just have another question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so my other question is, on our paper money, of course, we have a God we trust under it. If you were to choose exactly what we would put under it instead of God we trust, what would you choose?
I mean, I liked it the way it was in the beginning when it was e pluribus unum, and it was just that. E pluribus unum is this great unifying sentiment, right? From many, one, from many people, one nation, from many states, one country. And that it didn't get totally wiped out, it's on some still. But I would love to see that unifying, united sentiment there. The same thing with the Pledge of Allegiance. One nation, indivisible, literally dividing the indivisible with God, right? I'd like to see more unity and less disunity stemming from religion. Thank you for the questions.
I have a strategy question.
Okay.
I drove down 45 minutes from DeLand.
Well, thank you.
It's one of the towns on your secular invocations coming up, so I was happy to hear that. Our city seal has a heart anchored in a cross. And just curious, in your experience fighting these type of things, is it good to approach that from a state church division thing, or take the Satanist approach and say, no, we don't want you to get rid of the cross, we just want you to add Beelzebub?
This is a great question. And I love the Satanic Temple. I have a big red button on my desk that says Lucian on it. But that strategy to me should be sort of a last resort, and that's kind of how they use it. Because really the goal should be, we want state and church separate. It's just if you are going to defend, you, government, are going to defend your clear violation, the separation of state and church, by putting a cross on your seal, then we demand equal opportunity, equality, an equal level playing field. The best example of this that I think really brings it home happened out in Santa Monica, California, a number of years ago, before TST was even a thing, actually. There was Palisades Park, kind of a famous park in Santa Monica. And they had a nativity scene up there every year. And FFRF and a couple of other secular groups wrote letters saying, hey, you can't do that. That's definitely unconstitutional. And the city said, no. We let anybody put up anything that they want. And they said, and then they got a lot of requests. So they said, well, we're not going to let anybody. We're going to have 13 different spots, I think it was, and we're going to have a lottery. And then whoever wins the lottery gets to put their stuff up in the spot. And atheists won 11 of the 13. The LA Times ran a story that said atheists hijack displays or something like that. So in that case, it really is very, very effective. But if you go into it making that argument right out of the gates, then you're shooting state-church separation in the foot in a way. So there's definitely a time and a place for it. And I mean, the secular invocations is another really, really great example, actually, because the Supreme Court said, yeah, this is totally legal. It doesn't violate the separation of state and church. So what are you supposed to do at that point? The only thing you can do at that point is argue for inclusion. So I think it is a question of just when to employ that strategy. And it's paid off, I mean, in spades for CFFC, and it's been great watching what they're doing with the secular invocations. So definitely a time and a place for it. Hello.
How are you? My name is Jack. Is your book being sold on Amazon?
My book is being sold on Amazon. If you've already read it, please leave a review on Amazon. Unless you didn't like it, in which case, keep it to the side.
Part of the proceeds can go to this organization.
You can benefit CFFC on Amazon using the smile.com, absolutely.
My big question is, a serious question I have. Do you think George Carlin's correct when he thought the Ten Commandments was a marketing decision?
I quote George Carlin in my book a couple times. You have to buy a copy and see what's up?
It was 10 this and 10 that,
Yeah.
so 10 Commandments had to be 10.
Yeah, I mean, and it really, it's a funny joke, but it also makes a lot of sense because there's no real theological or literal or biblical reason to separate out the Ten Commandments from the 613 rules that come in those chapters, the 613 mitzvah. There's no real sort of stopping point when you get to 10. And it doesn't number them anywhere in the text. It doesn't say, this is the first commandment, this is the second commandment. It's just a list of things. And then remember, there are 4 different sets in any Bible. So Exodus 20, Exodus 34, Deuteronomy 5, and Deuteronomy 27. And the Exodus 34 set, the second set, Decalogue 2.0, that is the one that is actually called the Ten Commandments, not the first set that we think of, the Charlton Heston angry set. Well, those were 15. So anyway, I mean, it is, he's really not wrong. It is marketing in a way. 10 is much easier to remember.
And lastly, did you pick that tie out yourself?
No, I I never ever have taken fashion advice from atheists, so I'm not.
With the current makeup of SCOTUS, are organizations like FFRF and other ones that litigate church state going to have to be much more selective in which cases to take? I mean, I would have much rather seen like the Pensacola case in front of SCOTUS rather than Blandensburg.
Yeah.
So what's going on with strategy behind the scenes and making those decisions right now?
Absolutely, and obviously I can't talk too deeply about that, but you're right on to hone in on that as a problem. I mean, the Supreme Court right now is awful, completely unfriendly. Justice Canterbury? Yeah. He specifically said that he thinks the wall of separation is a bad metaphor based on bad history. All but said he can't wait to tear it down. Gorsuch is similar, Alito, Thomas. I mean, there's a lot of justices on the Supreme Court. They just accepted cert in a case out of Montana, which is a voucher school case, meaning accepted cert meaning they're going to review this and they're going to decide it. And let me see if I can explain this simply. Basically, there's a chance, I think it's a very good one. The court shouldn't have accepted it for a number of procedural reasons, right? Because the question that the parties asked the court to review wasn't decided at lower court level. And that's really weird for the Supreme Court to take a case like that. Normally they let everybody fight it out in the lower courts and only take it once that's been done. The fact that they took it before then is a very alarming sign. I don't know any other way to read it. But right now, the law is, for the most part, government can't fund religion. And they can't do that because the government cannot use its taxing power to take money from you and then turn around to give it to a religion that you disagree with. It is a religious freedom issue. And the religious liberty at issue lies with you, the taxpayer, right? The government cannot use the coercive power that it holds to tax its citizens and then give that money away to a religion that you do not adhere to, right? Muslims don't want to be paying for, churches, and Christians don't want to be paying for mosques. We don't want to be paying for anything. You can extend it however you want. It's a religious liberty issue. And FFRF won a big case on this out of New Jersey recently. What the argument in this vouchers case out of Montana is essentially, the fear is that the court is going to decide that excluding religion from the public coffers violates the religious liberty of religion. Meaning that states would have to fund church schools in the same way they fund public schools. That's the big fear out of that case. And you can see the court. The reason I say this at the beginning, that there's all these weird procedural issues, is the court wants to take this. So we can only be careful to a certain extent. But FFRF, and I know some of the other groups are doing this, we are looking at other ways. The big case that we won was in New Jersey State Court. And we won it unanimously at the New Jersey Supreme Court because we're shifting resources to battling things in states versus in federal court. We're also shifting resources to battle things in government as opposed to in the courts. We hired a lobbyist full-time now who's in DC working for FFRF. So there are things that we can do. And it's a scary time, but it's certainly, the law is still on our side, the Constitution is still on our side, even if the justices aren't at this particular point in time. But I know all the groups are retooling. And this to me is one of the reasons that CFFC and groups like it and local activism is going to be so critical right now. Because no matter what the law says, you can still change things locally. You can still force change. You can stop state church violations without the law being on your side if you get enough people speaking up at a public meeting. So we're also going to need to see a lot more local support of the national organizations than we've ever seen in the past.
You mentioned something about the different versions of the Ten Commandments and different, different numbering systems, etc. And I can attest, I was raised Catholic, and I always wondered why society was so obsessed with the Seventh Commandment, because to me it was thou shalt not steal. With that in mind, do certain religious groups like Catholics and Latter-day Saints, for example, do Catholics realize that the version of the Ten Commandments that these people want to put in public in public spaces are not their 10 commandments. Do Mormons realize that when they want to impose Christian law, they're not going to include the Book of Mormon in that? And is there room for perhaps an unholy alliance with some of these groups that are likely to be, to convince some of these people that, it's not going to be your version of Christianity and this is why we need freedom of religion. Yeah. Is there any room to convince people that you are not all unified on this?
That is absolutely one of the arguments we need to be making. I say in the book, I think I say it a couple times, there is no freedom of religion without a government that is free from religion. Secular government is hands down the best guarantee for genuine religious liberty. That is why, one of the reasons that the founders established a secular government in the first place. Your point about the Ten Commandments is, to me, one of the most interesting things out there. Are there any Ten Commandments monuments in Florida?
Yeah, 2 counties, one of them has an atheist bench next to it.
Yeah.
There's ours in South Florida.
Yeah.
Start in.
So if you ever go look at a Ten Commandments monument in Florida, or there's one in Denver on the Capitol grounds, there's one in Austin on the Capitol grounds, they don't appear, the Ten Commandments that appear on those don't appear in any Bibles. They're edited and amended pretty heavily. For instance, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children to the 3rd and 4th generation for the iniquity of the parents. That's in the Ten Commandments. Punishing innocent kids to the 3rd and 4th generation is in the Ten Commandments. That's not only the Ten Commandments monument. They edited it out. Slavery, mentioned twice in the Ten Commandments. Not in any of the Ten Commandments monuments. Well, at least not that I've seen. I shouldn't say it's not in any of them. They edited it out. They edited it out to conform with modern moral principles, because religion is not the source of our morality. So to me, this is actually, those are monuments, I think this is how I say it in the book, those are monuments to a lie. Right? Those monuments themselves disprove the very point that they are trying to make. They're trying to say that the Ten Commandments informed the history and founding of this nation, then why don't they actually have the Ten Commandments on? Why are they editing them to conform with moral principles of today? Because they didn't. They disproved it.
Hi, Andrew.
Hi, good to see you again.
My question is much simpler than most of them, and I was prompted to come up here because of the young man that was up here asking questions. One of the ways that we expand minds is to get books into people's hands. Do you, or do you through FFRF, have any kind of a matching fund where I can say I will contribute, I will buy a book that will go into a public high school so that your words will be accessible to them?
That is not something that FFRF has explored or that I've heard of before. I have had a lot of people on social media reach out and say, I wanted you to know that I requested that our public library order a copy of your book, which I think is a great idea, and I was very touched by that personally. I'm a big fan of
I know the school systems tend to have limited budgets than a township that's buying for their library.
I mean, I'm certainly willing to hear more from you about that. It's something you're the first person to suggest that idea, so I'd be happy to hear more. And we can talk about
some people keep me up.
Hello, Andrew.
Hi.
My name is Sam. Enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
Obviously, one of the issues that Christian nationalism really targets is women's rights issues over the last few months. It's become a lot more loud, I guess. Sorry about that. To your knowledge, what are some of the other major Supreme Court decisions that might be threatened because of Christian nationalism?
I mean, the Bladensburg Cross decision that I already mentioned absolutely has many strands of Christian nationalism running through it. Even the elevation of history over legal principle is one of them. I mean, certainly the fight over Roe that you are seeing right now is motivated by Christian nationalism. There's no doubt about that. There is, and I believe, I do talk about Project Blitz in the beginning of the book. How many people have heard of Project Blitz? So Project Blitz, for those of you who did not raise your hands, which you really ought to familiarize yourself with this is a playbook, a literal playbook put together by a couple Christian nationalist outfits where they are writing model legislation for state legislatures to adopt. And it starts off with things like putting In God We Trust on display in the public schools, or getting the In God We Trust or One Nation Under God, rather, license plates adopted by the states. So it starts off with kind of these ceremonial things, declaring a week of the Bible. And then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And the eventual goal, by the time you get to tier 3, is to make Christians a favored class and all non-Christians a subclass, disfavored legally subclass. The goal is literally to codify Christian privilege even more into the law. So there are tons and tons of fights that could come up to the Supreme Court, tons and tons of fights that are already in the courts. I mean, one of the things that I'm shocked at FFRF, we get between 4,000 and 5,000 state church complaints every year at the Freedom from Religion Foundation. The attorneys there, we have 9 permanent attorneys. We use our law degrees to stand up to religious bullies every single day. And there are times where I'm like, you know what, now I have seen it all. I have seen every manner of state church violation. Nothing is going to surprise me. And then sure enough, the next week, something new pops up. So yeah, it's too hard to say, but there's a lot that we are fighting on every single front you can possibly imagine, and then 10 times more than that.
You're doing great on time. We've got 4 more questions and then no more after that, okay?
Thank you for being here. It was interesting listening to pretty much everything you had said. In particular about, don't give up hope.
Yeah.
Because that seems to be a real challenge today. That being said, something that I've seen and watched with the Trump sideshow going on over here, Mitch McConnell has been installing federal judges at breakneck speeds, and those judges have been recommended and endorsed by extreme conservative organizations and views. To the point to where that part does scare me and concerns me greatly for long-term hope. 2-part question, I guess. How long is this going to take us to fix? And what are we going to do for strategy to fix this?
I mean,
it's definitely
it's going to take a long time to fix. There are a lot of smarter people than I am talking about how to fix the federal courts now that they've been corrupted in this manner. I mean, you've probably all heard about a court packing plan right now. Currently, I'm for that. The arguments that I've heard against it seem to be, we don't want to make the court political. I don't want to shake the people who are saying that because, that ship has sailed. It sailed when Gorsuch was pushed through. Well, before that, the year before that, when Merrick Garland was not allowed to hear it. I mean, you could even argue before that. We could go back to Bush v. Gore on that. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of talk about how to fix that. And I mean, that could be it. Maybe I'll have to come back and talk about that at some point. That's too long of an answer, I think. I'm not going to leave it there. Sorry.
Oh, Andrew, my name is Choice. Will you sign my book, please?
I will. I'm going to do it afterwards. I'm going to do it afterwards. I want to finish the question. David, we have books to sell. I think it's back through there. We have a bunch of books to sell. We're likely going to sell out, which stings for the people in Boca Raton who were expecting to get more books tomorrow night. But tough for them. They should have been up here with you guys. So yeah, they're $25. These are books that I'm selling through FFRF, so I'm donating all the royalties from these books back to FFRF. I am happy to sign them and write whatever else you might want in the front, depending. I might have to charge you extra.
Hi, thanks for coming. My question is, wouldn't the sanctity of human life, our natural God-given rights, as the founders called them, be attributable to Judeo-Christian thought?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And the founders didn't really refer to our God-given rights ever. There's a whole chapter on this in the book because this and the idea that Christianity influenced our morality, and that morality was sort of a prerequisite for the founding of the country are probably the two best arguments from the other side, but mostly because the counter arguments are a little harder to formulate than you would think. So typically the God-given rights argument you hear in the context of the Declaration of Independence, right? What does it say in there? And thou by our Creator? endowed by their creator, small difference, but I think worth noting. And that Jefferson didn't actually write those words. They weren't in his original draft of the Declaration. He laid out the political philosophy of the Declaration with only one pseudo-religious reference, the laws of nature and of nature is God. If you look closely at that one, that is very clearly an invocation of natural law. And so natural law is what you're talking about. It's where do our rights come from? And Jefferson's belief, and he was very clear about this, and you can read the book and see where he talks about it elsewhere, was that it was from a natural law, as opposed to a supernatural natural law, like a God. And those are the two sort of divisions of natural law. You get rights just because you are a human being, or you get rights because God gave them to you, right? Supernatural natural law, natural natural law. We know Jefferson was talking about this one. There's no doubt. Human rights by virtue of being human. And that's actually critical, because God-given rights can be taken away by those claiming to speak for God. Human rights cannot be. God-given rights are incredibly weak. They're dependent on your geography, where you live, under what regime you live in. Human rights are not. You get them simply by virtue of being human. If you want to read more about that, but not by the book, I wrote a couple articles about this, I think for Religion Dispatches, one for Religion News. Google my name and God-given rights and it will probably pop up. Very common misunderstanding, but that is not the source of our rights, and the founders were absolutely clear about that.
Just very quickly, Christian nationalism obviously is going to get more shrill before it gets less shrill, and more proactive before it gets less active. I think I read about an initiative, may have even been a bill introduced in Missouri to try to out donors. And I know that was directed, in the commentary, that it was directed at groups like FFRF.
Yeah, not quite. So this was a bill in Missouri, you're right. And what it would have done would have prohibited individuals from suing the government and arguing a state church violation from doing that under a pseudonym. So Roe versus Wade, Roe is not Jane Roe's real name. Right? She litigated that case under a pseudonym for privacy reasons. Typically, courts don't want to do that. Typically, our courts are part of our public system. We want them to be fair and open where everybody can see. However, there are instances where judges have the discretion to say this person can proceed under a pseudonym. And they'll issue what's called a protective order, meaning that none of the parties can release that person's name publicly. And this happens in our cases a lot because there's often violence towards plaintiffs in state church cases. We've written a couple of briefs about this. They're probably up on FFRF's website. I wrote one in the Chino Valley School Board prayer case, where we got pseudonyms for about 18 of our plaintiffs, including some employees of the school district. But the things that we've seen, houses have been firebombed, parents have been assaulted. There's something called proxy violence. This is so common that there's a phrase for it, proxy violence, where people's pets are murdered. That happens regularly to litigants in state church cases. Though I gotta say it's been happening less recently. Which I think says something about the work that we've been doing, all of us, not FFRF.
So it's not directed at donors?
Not directed at donors. So what that law would do is prohibit people from proceeding under a pseudonym. So you would have to go under your own name, and it would be publicly available, and you know exactly why they're trying to do that. Yeah. They're trying. It's the heckler's veto. It's the threat of violence that comes with having to then take a case in court. So.
Congratulations on the book, Andrew, and thank you for being here.
Oh, freedom from religion in this nation. We need our freedom.